Hi everyone, welcome back to the crash course. We're here in verbal reasoning, and today we are going to be going over what the questions look like, what the passages look like, and the strategies you want to use while reading. We aren't going to go into as many practice problems here. In the next video, we're going to go over all the different types of question stems and how to answer them. But for this video here, we're going to look primarily at just the reading and how to get better at that. Just a quick recap on the verbal section, you're going to face either 2 or 3 sets of 20 questions of verbal, and reading comprehension makes up about 9 or 10 out of the 20 questions. So if you get 3 sections, you want to anticipate you might have to do somewhere around 27 to 30 reading comp questions. And if those associated passages are quite long and tedious, this can be one of the most time-consuming and mentally draining parts of the test. So when you encounter one of these reading comp passages, what you can anticipate is anything from just a short paragraph with a single question up to like a 4 or 5 paragraph long passage with 4 associated questions, or anything in between. A lot of the time you're going to see these medium passages with maybe 2 or 3 questions. And the question styles have a little bit of variance. They do have the standard 5-choice, multiple choice questions. They also have 3-choice, select all that apply, which often function a lot like sort of like a true or false type setup. And they also, on the computerized test, have a select in passage question. And all that means is that you're just going to have to click on your answer. Just to get familiarized with what this is going to look like, this is sort of a standard setup for a reading passage. So you can see that the passage is situated on the left side, and if it's extremely long, there'll be a scroll bar that you can navigate up and down, and the question will be on the right. So you'll always have the text side by side with your question. You don't have to worry about paging back and forth to be able to look something up. And you can see that with this standard 5-choice, multiple choice question, there are little ovals that you would be able to bubble in. You would just click on your answer. Whereas if you get one like this with 3 choices with boxes, each box will sort of get ticked individually, and you just want to tick all the ones that apply. So a nice rule of thumb for the test is that if it's a circular selection, there's just one answer, whereas if there's boxes, it's one or more. And then lastly, we have the select a line. So when you get a question like this, there won't be any choices over here. You'll just have to mouse over on the left side and click on one of these sentences, and it will highlight it to let you know which one that you've selected. Let's start by looking at what most people consider like the worst question on the test, and that's the long reading passages, the ones that are just monsters, 5 paragraphs long with 4 questions associated. And one of the best strategies for this is to skip it and come back later, especially if it's boring, dense, if it's a really long passage, you just aren't sure how much time you should spend on it. The reason for that is because on the GRE, within a section of 20 questions, you are free to skip forward and backward as much as you want. And when you start this set of 20 questions, you're probably going to get 7 or 8 text completion questions, and then you'll probably hit this long reading comp section in the middle. Not always, sometimes it's short ones, sometimes the long ones at the end, but if you do happen to hit this extremely long reading comp section in the middle, you might be better off skipping it and just going on to the rest of the questions, because after that will be sentence equivalents, which we haven't talked about yet, but they'll be just short single blank questions, and you can anticipate that there might be some other smaller, less time consuming reading passages at the end. And so my recommendation is that as you're working through, finish the text completion, skip over that long passage, finish the rest of the test, and then depending on how much time you have left, then you know how to pace yourself for that long passage. If you get to the end and you see, oh, I only have 4 minutes left, well, then you really just have to skim and maybe isolate 1 or 2 questions you can take a good shot at. Whereas if you get to the end and you realize, oh, I have 12 minutes left, I can read a little bit more leisurely and take my time here. A common thing I get asked is, how should I be reading these passages? What should I be looking for? Why am I getting lost? Why am I reading through it and not remembering what I read? These passages are a bit dry, and they can often be sort of full of things that you don't really need to know. So the main things you want to look for as you're reading through, you want to try to get an idea about the main idea, and not just the overall main idea, but also of each of the paragraphs, right? So if it's a very long passage with, say, 3 or 4 paragraphs, at the end of it, you should be able to, at least to yourself, recount what was the main idea of the whole thing and what was the purpose of each of those paragraphs. Also, you want to be able to identify what the author's tone is. By the time you've read through the first time, you should be able to say, oh, the author was trying to be persuasive, or the author was trying to elaborate on this point, or the author was trying to defend a particular figure from criticism, right? Because this is one of those things where if a question asks you about author's tone, it's very hard to just go back and find a spot in the passage where you can get an idea about the tone. That's really something that comes holistically from reading the whole thing. And so if you missed it on the first pass through, it can often be not very time efficient to go back and try to reread again for tone. And lastly, you want to be looking for varying or contrasting viewpoints. So a lot of these passages are set up with the author having a point of view and the author going about addressing or conceding points to or qualifying their opinion in relation to critics or contemporaries, etc. So if those are the things you should be looking for, there are things that people commonly get stuck on that they would be better off just skimming over. And the number one thing is jargon. So especially on scientific passages, they'll throw in field-specific language, just these long scientific words that you don't really need to know. You might be able to kind of suss out a definition, but don't let that stop you from reading the passage. Don't get hung up on it and feel like you're losing meaning, because all the questions will not require any prerequisite knowledge about the subject. Everything you need to answer the questions is in the passage. And so as you're reading, if you encounter one of those words, just hop over it and just keep going and try to make sense of it without that word. And the same thing can be said of other little factoids like names and dates. If you need that information, that's easy to go back and find, right? You're better off just sort of making a little mental note about it, but then moving on, as opposed to trying to memorize every detail as you read. Let's just take a look at a long passage. We aren't going to work through this. Feel free to if you want. I'll leave a link to this. This is just the ETS practice book. But you can see that a long passage is, can be quite long. This one's only 2 paragraphs, but they're quite long paragraphs. And you can see it says questions 9 to 12 are based on this passage. So it'll tell you up front how many questions are going to be based on a passage when you see it on the test. And you can see that there are, 4 questions associated. And even if you just start to read, you can sort of see some of the things we're talking about, right? Names and dates, not that important. It's really better as you read through that you can mentally say to yourself, the first paragraph was roughly about this, the second paragraph was roughly about this, the overall purpose that the author had for writing this is blank, right? Because when you get a question like question 9 here, the passage is primarily concerned with, it's not just something you can go back and look at a particular line and say, oh yeah, that's the primary concern. It's really something you only get from that holistic reading. And so make sure you prioritize that when you're reading through these long passages. So moving on from the longer passages, which you can anticipate maybe seeing one, you'll see that the next couple passages, so here we have a medium passage with 2 questions associated, and then a smaller passage with 1 question associated. There's the sentence equivalence, and then another medium, another medium, another medium. So let's go ahead and look at some strategies for medium style passages. So when dealing with medium passages, it's similar to the longer passages, although people tend to have less trouble because there's really less to deal with here. But if you are having trouble organizing your thoughts or understanding what the author is trying to say, a majority of the time, medium style passages kind of fit into the same template, where what they're dealing with is some sort of classic, traditional, or orthodox view, and then some new theory or some change or some contradictory evidence that has come out, and then they'll give some supporting evidence for one side or the other. So if we take a look at what this looks like, if you're following along on the practice book, I pulled out 3 of the medium sections, and you'll see I listed the page numbers there. So if you want to go to that document and answer the questions about it, go ahead. But if you can, take a second to just sort of skim through these 3 passages, and let's take a look at some of the things that they have in common. Now, it can be difficult for almost anybody to just read these sorts of passages and get anything out of them, especially just reading them like this, sort of isolated. But if you were reading through these and you were really feeling like, wow, I can't make any sense of this, I didn't get any relevant information out of it, I want to encourage you to sort of think about it like I'd mentioned before. We're looking for like a traditional view, a new view, and supporting evidence. And so if we look through all 3 of these, you can see they mention in the first one, widely held beliefs, standard view, right? In the second one, orthodox position. In the third one, common belief. So all of them are establishing at some point that there is a traditional way of thinking about things or an orthodox position that exists. And then if we look further, we can see that they all sort of flip this, right? The first one says there is this process that challenges this widely held belief. In the second one, in contrast to the orthodox position, there is this strikingly different approach, right? Or in the last one, however, and then they lead into sort of evidence against the common belief. And so all of them make this turn at some point in the passage. And they all have a large chunk that's just dedicated to laying out some facts, laying out some supporting evidence for the position that the author wants to take. So if you can see these passages as having these three pieces to them and find a way to read and look for these things, I think that can help make sense of most medium passages. So if you want, go back and reread these three and see if they make more sense given this context. The last type of question you're going to see, and you can expect to see maybe one or two of these out of every 20 questions, are the short critical reading or logical reasoning passages. And they are a pretty big departure from the other two types of passages. The short passages are not authoritative. So whereas when you read a long passage, you sort of read it like a textbook. You just assume that what you're reading is true. When you read a short passage, you should try to assume that the author is not a good author, is trying to mislead you, is mistaken in their conclusions, or has left out key information. And what you really want to pay attention to is what is the author's conclusion or argument literally? What does it say verbatim in the passage that the author concludes? Because that's often what the passage or what the question is asking you to respond to. And very much like the argument task on the essay section, you're kind of playing devil's advocate. The author is going to have made a couple assumptions based on evidence, and it's up to you to find a way to show that those assumptions might not be correct. So if we look at one of these short passages, and you can see it's pretty short, right? If you see something that's just a few sentences long with one question attached, on my little mock-up here, this up here would just say like question 15 is based on this passage. You'll know that if there's one question attached, it's probably one of these logical reasoning passages. And if you go ahead and take a second to read through this, you'll see this last line, it's typically the last line, is the author's conclusion, right? Consequently, once the housing is occupied, the annual number of the forest deer hit by cars will be much higher than before construction started. And the question reads, which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? They might word this different ways, and we'll look at this in the next video, but essentially, what is your job here? Your job is to sort of go through these 5 options and indicate which one the author should have included or which one the author needs in order to reach this conclusion. And the other type of question here is basically the opposite. There'll be a same sort of setup, but then they'll say which of the following undermines or weakens the author's argument. And then again, it's up to you to sort of figure out what did the author leave out or what does the author not know that makes them wrong. So the manner of thinking about this type of question is very different than the long and medium passages. And that concludes the first part on reading comprehension. In the next video, we're going to put these strategies to use and go through a ton of practice problems, look at all the different question stems and types of questions that you might encounter and how to go about that. So if you have any questions about reading strategies or want any advice on particular problems that you're having, leave it in the comment section. I'll try to get back to you. Otherwise, I hope you'll join me in the next video, and I hope that you're all learning something. So thanks for watching.